Today, I want to talk to you about something that is often simplified, but is actually incredibly complex. And that is what happens to the female brain and body during perimenopause and menopause. Most conversations frame menopause as a reproductive milestone. It's described as the end of cycles or maybe even the beginning of hot flashes. But biologically, it represents something much deeper. It is a systemic transition that affects how the brain processes information and how the body regulates energy and how muscles and bones are maintained and how long-term cardiovascular and metabolic health evolve. And what many women experience during this time is not just symptoms, it's a shift in how their body feels to live in. So rather than thinking about menopause as an endpoint, it helps to think of it as a recalibration phase. The internal environment changes, and the body has to learn to function within that new environment. So let's talk about hormones now as regulators. One of the most important things to understand is that hormones are not simply reproductive signals. They are regulatory signals. Estrogen, for example, influences neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And that means it affects mood, motivation, and cognition, and even clarity. It also supports blood flow to the brain and helps the cells produce energy efficiently. Progesterone plays a different but equally important role. It interacts with the brain's calming systems, particularly GABA pathways, which influences sleep quality and stress tolerance for that matter. When progesterone declines, which often happens earlier than women expect in what we call the perimenopausal timeframe, things like sleep can feel lighter and stress can feel more intense. Testosterone, another hormone. And this hormone is really often overlooked in women's health. Even in smaller amounts, it contributes to strength, to drive, to mental sharpness, and even libido. And these hormones are not operating independently. They function as a network. And when one shifts, the others have to adjust, and the entire system responds. So, what do women actually notice in menopause? In real life, this transition rarely feels like a clear medical event. It usually begins as a collection of very subtle changes that don't immediately seem connected. Women often describe feeling like their body responds differently than it used to. The same workouts don't produce the same results. Sleep doesn't feel as restorative, and stress lingers a little bit longer. Some notice oftentimes weight accumulating around their midsection, even though their habits really haven't changed. And others describe a phenomenon known as brain fog, right? It's not severe memory loss, but moments of slower recall or difficulty finding words. And perhaps most importantly, many women sense that their resilience has changed. Things that once felt manageable now require more effort. And these experiences can feel confusing because externally, things may not have changed, but internally, hormonal signaling has shifted. Now, let's talk about the brain and what happens during this transition. So, the brain is particularly sensitive to these changes. Estrogen receptors exist in areas responsible for memory, for emotional regulation, and what we call executive function. When estrogen fluctuates, these systems have to adjust, which can influence focus, mood stability, and even mental clarity. Estrogen is important because it supports how the brain uses glucose for energy. And as levels of estrogen decline, the brain has to adapt. But during that adaptation period, energy can feel inconsistent. An area of the brain called the hypothalamus is an area that regulates temperature, sleep cycles, and even the appetite. And this area is highly hormone sensitive. And this really helps to explain why sleep disturbances, hot flashes, mood variability often appear together as a cluster of symptoms during this time in a woman's life. And so when viewed individually, these symptoms can feel random. When viewed together, they reflect a coordinated neuroendocrine transition. So let's talk a little bit now about what aging can look like without hormonal support. Over time, if hormonal changes are not supported, whether through lifestyle adjustments or medical interventions, the way aging feels can begin to shift. Muscle becomes harder to maintain. Recovery slows. Fat distribution changes, often toward the abdomen. Blood sugar regulation may feel less stable, even in women who have always been metabolically healthy. Sleep can become lighter, or emotional resilience may even fluctuate even more. Cardiovascular risk is also something that can evolve. Estrogen helps to maintain the flexibility in blood vessels. And as levels of estrogen decrease, vascular health becomes more dependent on lifestyle and metabolic factors. Now, none of this means decline is inevitable, but it does mean that the internal landscape has changed, and strategies that worked in earlier decades may no longer be sufficient on their own. So, what does this mean practically? For many women, midlife is the point where the body becomes less forgiving. Poor sleep has a bigger impact. Chronic stress takes longer to recover from. Strength training becomes essential rather than optional. And understanding this helps remove unnecessary self-criticism. These shifts are not a failure of discipline. They reflect a change in hormonal signaling and metabolic priorities. And once that framework is understood, many women feel relief. The experience starts to make sense. So let's talk about what options are available for women during this time and during this season of their lives. So when it comes to support, there is not one single answer. Lifestyle has to be the foundation, right? Our health, our activity levels, our lifestyle, that has to be the foundation. So things like strength training, that is so important. It helps to preserve muscle and metabolic health, making sure that women are having adequate protein intake. Why? Because it supports recovery, and it even supports neurotransmitter production. It helps with building healthy muscle mass. Another thing, you got to protect your sleep, because sleep becomes one of the most powerful interventions. Why? Because it influences nearly every system affected by hormonal change. Something else to mention is that women during this time really benefit from targeted supplementation. Magnesium, for example, is really important in so many factors, but it can actually improve sleep quality, helps with muscle recovery as well, helps with brain health. Omega-3s, omega-3 fatty acids, what do? They help support cardiovascular function. They also help to shift the inflammatory balance, sort of more favorable balance in women and men for that matter. Also, omega-3s are great for the brain. One of my favorite supplements in both men and women, but since we're specifically talking about women, is that women don't often think about taking creatine. They think of that mainly as something that men use to kind of build their muscles. But creatine is increasingly being studied for both muscle preservation and cognitive performance. So that's a key. What's another big thing that we can do during this time frame? Well, hormonal therapy. Now, this is a very important option that really deserves a more nuanced conversation than it often receives. When we talk about hormone therapy, I speak to it in terms of bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, meaning we are using hormones that are structurally identical to those produced by the body. And when prescribed thoughtfully and monitored appropriately, estradiol and progesterone are really important in improving sleep, stabilizing mood, and reducing hot flashes, and also in supporting bone and metabolic health. And let's not forget testosterone also being important in terms of drive and libido, and also maintaining healthy muscle mass. So much of the stigma surrounding hormone therapy comes from older research that did not reflect current practices. What I'm talking about is the Women's Health Initiative, which was really interpreted poorly and did a huge disservice to women and how we have treated balancing hormones over the last several years. Modern approaches, however, emphasize individualized dosing, careful screening, and ongoing monitoring. And for women who choose not to use hormones, there are some non-hormonal treatments that exist that can actually help address some of these specific symptoms. So as we close today's podcast, I want to help you realize that perimenopause and menopause are not just reproductive transitions. They represent a shift in how the brain, metabolism, and cardiovascular system communicate and adapt. And understanding that shift helps to replace confusion with clarity. If this conversation resonated with you in some way, please share it with someone who may be entering this phase and looking for thoughtful, science-based information. And if you are navigating this transition yourself, begin by understanding what is happening inside your body and work with providers who approach hormonal health with nuance and personalization. Because when women understand the process, they are far better equipped to move through it with confidence and intention. Thanks for joining us today. See you next time.
This podcast is for general informational and inspirational purposes and does not constitute the practice of medicine or any healthcare services. No doctor-patient relationship is established, and the content in these episodes is not intended to diagnose, treat, or give medical advice, nor is this a substitute for seeking professional medical care. The use of the information discussed is at the user's own risk.